So here we are again on Grail Country. This is going to be part 8 of our ongoing series on meditations on the tarot. This time we're dealing with letter 8, which is on justice. And joining me today are Sherry and Michael. Do either of you have anything that you'd like to say at the outset? You want to talk about like the image on the card or the general description, or if there's like something, an immediate thought that you wanted to jump right into? I'm open. Go for it.
Well, I loved it. I think I love this chapter more than anything so far.
It's your favorite so far, huh?
Yeah. But I'm all about justice. Like I've always been this little justice warrior. Not a social justice warrior, but a yeah, it's one of the things that really gets my goat when I see, you know.
Yeah, that's one of the interesting things in this chapter is that I think that we probably will get around to talking about is the way that Tomberg uses the term equity and what he means by it
Yeah, it's great.
in this chapter, as opposed to the way that equity gets used within the social justice movement. I think that'll be an interesting thing to talk about when we get around to
Yeah, equity as revenge, right?
it.
That's not how he uses it. Yeah.
Not at
No,
all. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Do we want to jump right into that then? I mean we can.
I don't know. Do you have any thoughts, Michael? You're
Well, here he gets into a couple of things I've been actually thinking a lot about.
Okay.
And one of them is astrology,
Right.
okay.
right? What's the role of astrology in Christianity? Because I mean, that we don't have to go into that, but that's one thing he gets into here, which when I was reading through the chapter, because I kept reminding myself to look up what Aquinas says about astrology, because I read it years ago and I couldn't remember where it was.
Oh yeah.
And also Plotinus, and it's not what people would think.
Not at all. Yeah. Aquinas is not. Aquinas just. I mean, it's what Aquinas is think. Basically, what's wrong about it is if you think that it means that things are deterministic, then you're doing something wrong with it.
Yeah,
As long as you're not thinking of it as in a deterministic way, but as strictly as an influence, then that's just a cosmic truth.
which is what that famous maxim, right? The stars incline, they do not compel.
Exactly.
Which
Yeah,
he quotes at the end.
which
Here.
is Tomberg quotes in this chapter. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Which it's interesting because I've written about this in my blog a few times, but in commentaries on Matthew's gospel when the Magi come to see the Christ child, it's interesting to see commentaries from Protestant Bibles versus Catholic Bibles versus whatever. And some of them will I think the Jerusalem Bible or the Saint one of them says the note says the Magi were astrologers from the East, and others say they were scientists. Like there were no scientists. Well, like from that.
Yeah,
Right?
there were no scientists at that time.
And because otherwise, what would be the point of seeing his star in the East? Right.
Right, exactly.
I mean, it's kind of dumb, right?
That ties into something else he says. Let me see if I can find it. Hold on a second here.
I'm
Where he actually talks about Zarathustra or Zoroaster toward the end, where he's talking about let's see.
I guess you don't know the page, eh? Because you have the PDF.
No, it's toward the end. Otherwise, I would. Oh, here we go. Yeah, right here. I found it. Let's see. Oh, he says that's not the part I was looking for. He must mention it more than once.
No, it's on page 195.
Okay.
The magic of Zarathustra's mages will be revived and will live as the eternal human endeavor of aspiration towards light and life.
That's the one. Yes, that's the part that I was looking at. Yeah, that's actually in general that section is great because he talks about like
This is
essentially how all great spiritual traditions are brought together in Christ. Like that's what he's driving at there.
Behold, I make all things new.
right. I mean, that verse that he quotes after that section just took on a whole new meaning for me when I read it.
Right.
You know, it says, I have come so that nothing should be lost, but that all shall
Yeah.
have eternal life. Nothing shall be lost. It, for some reason, dawned on me that all those attempts by humanity to understand God, right, will not be lost. Nothing will be lost.
Right, exactly. Yes, that's yeah, I never really thought of that verse in that way either,
Right?
but it definitely, like, it makes sense. It's one of those things that makes sense once you see it.
I mean, I think for most people, it's how do you say that?
Anthropocentric.
Centric. Thank you. It's early in the morning.
For you.
For me.
Yeah, I've been up since 4,
And
Sherry.
they think of people, persons, right? But this is the beauty of a cosmic image of what God is doing in the world. You know,
Right.
It's everything. It's not just persons.
That reminds me, I discovered this great version of the hymn. Do you know the Anglican hymn? I'm sure Nate does. All Things Bright and Beautiful.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
I found a great version of it, which is kind of it's like as if the Byrds did a version of it.
Oh, nice.
Really jangly guitars by
Cool.
Oh, interesting.
I'll tell you the name of the group.
Yeah.
Because I was trying, because I love the lyrics to that, but I'm trying to find a good one to sing for house.
I sing that to my farm animals all the time.
Yeah, I bet they jump in on the refrain too.
Yeah.
But it's by this group called Rain for Roots.
Rain for Roots.
Look it up.
That's a great name.
It's off the chain. It's so good.
Yeah.
There's another group out there called the Lower Lights. Have you heard of them? And they also do like kind of folk music versions of a lot of hymns, like All Creatures of Our God and King. They're called the Lower Lights.
The Lower Lights.
And they have this one they do of All Creatures of Our God and King is so good.
Oh yeah, it's like my mom sent me like this kind of, like, I don't remember the name of the artist or the band who did it, but it was like a Celtic kind of styled arrangement of Blessed Assurance. That was really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think we got to take it back. I love them too, especially that's what I love about the Anglican hymnal. It's so it's so user friendly.
Yeah.
You know, because if you go like you do Mozart's Requiem or something, you know, that's a performance piece.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And the congregation is not going to sing along. Requiem, right? You're not going to do it. But that Anglican, I mean, and Ralph Vaughan Williams, the great composer, put that Anglican hymnal together in the early 20th century. And he wrote the tunes to a lot of these songs. And he wrote them as simple folk songs that everybody could sing along with.
Yep, that is definitely a characteristic of all of the hymns that he arranged. They're like very easy to sing.
And he was an accomplished composer.
Right. But he knew what he was doing. But he knew the purpose of what he was doing.
Yeah.
So he didn't like try to show off his composer chops by coming up with complex arrangements. He wanted to make them as easy to communally sing as possible, which is what they're for.
And two other words, Eleanor Fargen, who wrote lyrics to quite a number of those hymns, even before she was a Christian.
Right.
Right. Like Morning is Broken. Right. She wrote that one.
Right. Yeah. So getting back to
the tarot.
The meditations on the tarot here.
Oh yeah.
So this chapter is on justice. Is what would we want to say about what Tomberg sees justice as being here?
And we should preface this. He was a lawyer.
Oh, was he?
I was going to ask you
I
that
didn't know.
because
I don't-
the way
he
he was
never-
talking about Roman law and common law
Another
was very
lawyer.
much, oh, he's got to be a lawyer.
Garfield was a
he
lawyer.
was. I don't think he ever practiced law, but he did this doctoral dissertation on jurisprudence. So, but I don't think he ever practiced law. But his dissertation is available, I think, from Angelico Press. They were supposed to send me a copy.
Oh,
It's called Generation and Regeneration in Jurisprudence or something like that.
okay.
Oh,
So this guy knew he knew a little something about law in the Western tradition.
right.
Yeah, and that regeneration and resurrection is a big theme that he builds on in this chapter too. So that seems to have been connected to his thoughts about justice for quite some time, and maybe it just took him a long time to flesh that out as he does here.
Okay,
So
well, I
that's
have a question for you guys.
Absolutely.
On page 174, second paragraph, it says, law is interposed between the freedom of man and the freedom of God. She is seated between two pillars, that of will, Yakin, and that of providence, Boaz. She does not act, she can only react. This is why she is represented as a woman and not as a man. Help me understand that.
Receptivity.
Okay.
You know,
Okay,
that's kind of a psychological archetype, very Jungian, right? Is that,
right.
or like the moon reflects the light of the sun, a woman receives,
Right.
you know.
Okay. That makes
to-
sense
to-
now.
So that's what I think he's working with there.
Because I'm like,
And it's a very,
I'm
and-
not, because I'm always react.
and it's a very, I mean,
Right.
it's a way, in a way, it's a good thumbnail explanation of sophiology.
Right, right. Yeah, the
Right.
feminine. Yeah.
And then we should probably also, just as a reminder, in case people, even though we talked about it in a previous episode, just in case people need a reminder, the pillars that he's talking about are the pillars of the Temple of Solomon.
Yeah.
So
Who is Yakin?
those are the
Recognize
are
that.
The grandfathers of David,
Oh,
or
okay.
Solomon. Yeah, the grandfathers of David.
Yeah.
Okay.
so
So justice is just further down there, is the guardian of equilibrium between the individual and the universal,
yeah.
and has the power to reestablish it each time that it is violated. Order, health, harmony, justice. It is the balance which indicates equilibrium, or order, health, harmony, and justice, and it is the sword which signifies the power to reestablish it each time that the individual will sins against the universal will. So is that would you say that's the main idea of?
I don't think so. I wouldn't say
No.
it's the main idea. I think he's building up to it. I would say that ultimately ultimately what he's telling you is that love is the principle of justice, which is why this is why he sets up this idea of those who are metaphorically Greek and metaphorically Jewish, right? Those who worship power, or those who worship wisdom, and those who worship power, versus the Christian path of love, which is the
Right.
equilibrium.
Yeah.
So, and justice is where is the balance. So he's telling you that love is the balance, love is the equilibrium. So justice is actually, that's the path to justice, is through love.
Right. And that's, you know, he likes these antinomies, right? And so this is another one of those that he's doing. You know who else likes him is Bulgakov.
Mhm.
And but the one that Sherry just read, that goes to the resolution of the antinomy, goes back to Plato, right? The problem of the one and the many, right?
Right.
So the hoi polloi.
Yep.
So
Yeah.
how do you resolve those things? And as Nate was saying,
Yeah.
his
Yeah.
answer is through the Christian path, right?
Yep. Absolutely.
And I mean, if you just think about it for a few seconds,
And love is the resolution of the ancient problem of the one and the many. Like that's
Right.
like the specifically the Trinitarian love of the Godhead. Like that's the resolution of that.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Like, if you just think about it for a few seconds, I mean, that's really the only thing that bridges the gap.
Right. But it's not, it can't be grasped through your reason alone, though. It's not rational. But I just read a very interesting book by a young theologian named J.D. Lionheart, who I'm going to be talking to, it looks like possibly in early August. He wrote a book called Monotheism, an arrogant attempt to answer every question of the last 2,000 years one night in a pub. And it's like this, it's this great theological discussion, but he writes it in the form of a dramatic dialogue that literally is happening in a pub.
That's where I answer all my great theological questions.
Right, yeah.
Unfortunately, I never remember them the next day.
And the argument that he makes that's interesting, that I had never actually encountered before, is that what he's proposing in that book is that the kind of irrational contradiction that the Trinity is exactly the same kind of irrational contradiction that any attempt to explain the universe is.
Right.
So they're actually the same contradiction.
And you know what? And this is going to be really scatological, but that's what I think that Slavoj Žižek, if you're familiar with his philosophy, that's what he's interested in, the short circuit, right?
Yeah.
Because he knows there are all these inconsistencies in the rational path in logic and continental philosophy, or I should say analytic philosophy in particular. So what is it? And that's why I think Zizek feels that deep attraction toward the Christian tradition, even though he would never identify himself as a Christian.
Right.
So he's got this book, The Fragile Absolute. You ever read that one? Why the Christian Tradition is Worth Fighting For, I think is the subtitle. Right. Written by a non-Christian, right? And he wrote this in 2005. So man, called it, right? Right. But Thomberg, it's interesting. Thomberg says something interesting about the absolute in this chapter, though, where he contrasts the abstraction of the absolute to the living God. Yeah, here we go. I actually happened to stumble right on it. I can't give you the page number because I'm going from my highlighted PDF, which is different page numbers. You can certainly die and even live for God, but you would never die as a martyr for the absolute, because to die for the absolute amounts to dying for nothing. The idea of the absolute is only a shadow of shadows, whilst the living God is the prototype of prototypes. The prototype of prototypes, this means to say the universal Father. One of the meanings of the first commandment, thou shalt have no other gods before me, is that one should not substitute an intellectual abstraction of God for the spiritual reality of God. One therefore sins against the first commandment when one substitutes for the fiery, luminous, and vibrant being of life the abstractions of a principle or idea, be it the first cause or the absolute, which are, truth to tell, only mentally graven images, mental idols created by the human intellect. That's it, baby. And that's idolatry. He talks a lot about idolatry in icons. He does, right?
Yeah. I was just looking at that actually. An icon is the beginning of the way to spiritual reality. It does not replace it, as in idolatry. It gives an impulse and direction towards it. And
go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead and finish. Go ahead.
Well, it just reminded me of that example that I constructed once of the Norseman going out and finding a piece of wood and carving Odin's face into it because he's trying to describe his experience in the world and the interaction that he's having with the transcendent, right? And how that's okay as long as you don't create a space between you and that idol. That's how I see it anyway.
Right. Some idols aren't idols and some but icons.
Right.
And there are idols in our age. Most of our idols are these kind of abstract mental idols that Thomberg is talking about.
And you know who talks a lot about that are you familiar with Jean-Luc Marion?
I've heard the name, but I've never read
his book, God Without Being, and he's got, what's the other one? Icon and Idol, I think it's called. That's a big part of his philosophy, is that we might think sometimes that we're venerating an icon, but for him, an icon, like Thomberg says, opens us to the transcendent. Whereas an idol, he says, acts like a mirror. And so So it's actually, we're seeing our own desires. And we're like, it's like, yeah, Jesus is just like me. I knew it. You know, right? I knew it all this time.
Yeah.
But that's it. I mean, I think a very real danger for everybody
Yeah.
in every
Yes.
domain. I mean, even I think, one of my anxieties is to turn myself or the sociology into a product, right?
Right.
Something I'm selling here on the internet.
Yeah.
Right. And if you act now, you'll get 10% off, right? But it's so easy in these virtual environments to present a kind of avatar of yourself rather than yourself, right? And you pose as something, you project this image, but also that you do the same thing. So you're turning yourself into an idol in a way. But you also do the same thing with the version of God you're selling. You can, right? I mean, how do you keep that icon porous? And how do you not let it become a mirror? Because people who do this. I know people, sincerely religious people, who turn their sincere religiosity into a form of idol worship, and they have no idea they're doing it.
Yeah.
And if you can't point it out, because then you all of a sudden never point out a person's delusion, because they'll turn on you. Right?
Right. No. Yeah.
That's what happens.
Michael, it's so common that I would say it's almost the norm.
Yeah, I think so. And I
don't mean that in a judgmental way or to pretend that I'm superior in any way, because
we all do it.
We all do it. We all have we just have different forms of idols. It's a form of idolatry that the people who are practicing it are particularly blind to and not aware of, but everyone's blind to whatever the form of idolatry that they fall into is. That's
right. And somebody who just kind of underwrites most of what Tomberg thinks is Rudolf Steiner.
Yeah.
And one of the things that he said in this regard, he told somebody, I don't remember where I read this, but he said that I wish I could have a new name for anthroposophy every day, because people get attached to what they think it means.
Yes.
Right. So if you could have new name for Christianity every day, or what, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because you think you get so attached to, and this is why people ask me, can you give us the definition of sociology? I hate to do it because it becomes an idol. So, and you pin it down too much, you don't allow it room to live.
And it loses its very life in that process, right?
A great example of the opposite of that is like in one of Ivan Illich's interviews in French, like the interviewer asked him like why he hadn't mentioned the name Jesus Christ at any point in the interview so far. And he said, and Illich's answer was, I don't talk about my friends like that. Which is just perfect. Like that's right. Opposite of idolatry, right? That's like,
you don't want to spoil it. Yeah.
Right. I recently watched a conversation with a psychologist, and he was talking about, and it wasn't Jordan Peterson. He was talking about mirror neurons that we have. So he's done this lengthy research project on real conversation when people are actually in a room together. And he said that people will react or interject in a conversation. I can't remember the exact length of time. It was like microseconds, faster than you react in traffic. Because what happens is when two people face each other in real time, they actually connect through these mirror neurons. And while one is talking, the other one makes these micro gestures that mirror the other person. You can't see them. Some people we all probably know someone who has the habit of like talking, their lips are moving while you're talking to them. Well, that's kind of an exaggerated response, right? And then he was, and then in light of COVID and everything, and people on Zoom like we are, people feel exhausted when they have these kinds of conversations because their bodies are trying to connect to the other bodies, but they can't because
So
they're
they
not
can't do it.
in a real place. So
Right.
if you spend all day, you know, in your business or whatever on these Zoom conversations, you'll actually feel exhausted. And he called it, it was such a good phrase. It was the being present in the absence of the other. And I just thought that was really, really, really interesting, you know,
No, that is interesting.
because of idolatry. That's why it came to my mind, because
Right.
we have this innate thing that wants to connect to the thing we're looking at, right? And the scripture says that if you do connect to that idol, you become like it, right? Which would be this mirror neuron thing. Like you have eyes, but you see not. You have ears, but you hear not. You have hands, but you, right? So anyway, I just a sidetrack.
So Tomberg, like this idea of idolatry, I think you can see what's going wrong with the way justice is used in the social justice movement. Like you can see all the elements of this. First of all, justice is an idol for them because it's just the abstract. It's just the abstract justice. It's like it's disconnected from, you know, the living God. There's nothing.
Yeah.
It's just the abstraction itself. And the other thing is that Tomberg talks in this chapter about like quantitative justice,
yeah,
right, versus real justice, which is qualitative. And ultimately, for Tomberg, I think by the time you get to the end of this chapter, you can see that justice simply is love for him. By the time he gets to the end here, like there's no. That's what it is. It's the path. Justice is the path that of the equilibrium that puts you on the path of love. Like so that doesn't. It isn't choosing between wisdom and power, but it is the intermediary between them. And I think like it's disconnected from all of those things. It doesn't. It's quantitative and it's idolatrous and it's completely disconnected from any real justice.
Yeah. And on that note, he says right here, I have it underlined. The more a general idea is abstract, the more superficial it is.
Right.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
There's no depth to it, and that is what Hermeticism is.
Okay. I'm glad you mentioned that, Sherry.
Yeah.
I think we're deep enough into this book now. I can ask you a personal question.
Yeah.
What is Hermeticism?
Hermeticism. Oh my goodness. I've been asking myself that as I read the book, you know. It seems to me I could only describe it in what it does. I don't know if I could propositionally describe because I'm not good with propositions.
He defines it for you in this chapter. He tells you that it's an athenor, that it's like it's an alchemical process that takes the intellectual and transform it into the spiritual. So, for example, he gives Saint Augustine's use of Platonic philosophy, turning something that was merely intellectual into something spiritual, as an example of Hermeticism.
Mm-hmm.
He says the same thing of what Aquinas did for Aristotle as an example of Hermeticism. So it's something that takes the intellectual activity and then translates it into spiritual application.
Right. I would have described that process. Like I said, I'm not good at propositions at all. Okay. Yeah. That's what I would have described. Yeah.
And he does too here, Nate. He also, where it is, can't remember where it is, but he talks about how toward the end.
To me, it feels like a unifying force, Hermeticism.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Yes.
It's bringing all things together, right?
Toward the equilibrium, I would say, which is why he talks about it in this chapter of justice, because justice ultimately, that's what the idea of justice is. It's the equilibrium, the balance point. And it's the balance both on both the horizontal and the vertical, right?
Mm-hmm.
You find it yet, Michael?
No, but I will.
Okay.
Oh, here's one of the places he talks about, page 189. Now is the time for the Hermetic movement to make true Christian peace with the church and to cease to be her semi-illegitimate child.
Yes.
leading a half-tolerated life more or less in the shadow of the church, and to become eventually an adopted child, if not a recognized legitimate child. But it takes two to love, and there is many a pretension to be abandoned in order to accomplish this. What is sure, however, is that if the two parties in question have at heart only the glory of God, all obstacles to this peace will evaporate in smoke.
Right.
And then I think we were talking earlier about, had we started recording it when we talked about astrology?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's a good example is what John Milbank and others call the alternative modernity, right?
Right.
Which is basically what I do, right?
Yes, I know.
I got a different story. I'm telling a different story than modernity.
I think
Because
it's what
it's there.
it's what John Vervaeke is trying to point people toward too, which is like that's my new project, is to try to get John Milbank and John Vervaeke together
Might be
for a
interesting talk.
conversation.
Yeah. But that alternate, modernity that, and I wouldn't even call it esoteric or anything. People, when they ask me about the things I believe in or the things I think are true, I'm like, I'm not doing anything that hasn't been done for thousands of years,
Right.
whether it's astrology or pilgrimages or whatever it happens to be, right? Whether the stars influence us, whether there's an invisible kingdom of nature spirits out there or not, that's those, I think, and Milbank buys it too, right?
Yeah.
But it's only over the last 250 years where people thought that was childish or something.
Right. And I think, esoteric really just means that it's interior. So, right. So it's not necessarily a cult. I don't know if there is any more. I don't know is there any more occult after Christ? Isn't everything manifest? Is there anything that's truly a cult anymore?
Oh, I think there is.
Okay.
Yeah. I would say that too.
Yeah.
So what remains a cult then after the Christ event?
Whoever is running the World Economic Forum. But
okay, but anything that's a cult has nothing to do. Anything that's remaining, any occult that's remaining would be apart from Christ, then, right?
Well, yeah.
Okay, so that's fine. I can agree with you then, and still say that let's say that there's no truth, which is a cult anymore. That's what I mean.
And I think that's the whole Hermeticism maintains, though, that like I've talked about before and I've written countless times. And I think this is the tradition where it's obviously the tradition where you can plant Tomberg because he puts himself there.
Right.
But Rudolf Steiner, they really weren't doing
Charles Williams,
even Eliphas Lévy, the French cultist.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't doing anything new. I shouldn't say they weren't doing anything new. They were taking traditional practices from Christian history that also had, there were also vestiges of it or manifestations of it in classical paganism, but also in folk religion. They weren't adding anything to that except for, I wouldn't call it the spirit of Descartes or Bacon, but what those guys brought to culture with applying principles, kind of scientific principles, they would say. You have like Paracelsus, for instance, Thomas Vaughan, Robert Flood, who did not want to throw out the Christian inheritance that included all these things we've been talking about, and that Tomberg brings up time and again, with whether it's magic, sacred magic, or astrology, or whatever it happens to be. They didn't want to throw all that stuff out. They just wanted to bring it toward the future.
Right.
right? They didn't
Well,
want to throw it out like Descartes and Bacon and
did you happen to
Locke.
catch JP Marceau's conversation with John Vervaeke, the most recent one? Okay, that was really interesting because to me it was implicit from their conversation that John was kind of intuiting like a new kind of science that is rooted not in the objective but the participatory, which I think is exactly the same thing that
John's,
the hermeticists that you're talking about
and that's what I
or we're
write about in my
doing.
books. Yeah,
Right, exactly.
yeah,
And that's what sophiology is too. So
absolutely.
they're all pointing toward this same thing where it's like we don't even know what's possible if we get out of this objective mode.
Right, and that's what those scientists I mentioned from the 17th century. That's what they didn't want to let go.
Right.
Right, they recognized our, and of course, when you by the time you get to the early 20th century and the discovery of quantum physics, kind of proves that they were right all along. There is no such thing as a disinterested observer.
Right.
It's a myth. It's a modern myth.
Right. Which doesn't mean that there is no truth and that just like anything goes. It doesn't, unlike postmodernism, it doesn't throw everything into chaos.
Yeah, it's not deconstruction.
Because there still remains another pathway to truth that is simply not, that's not objective. And part of it is esoteric, right? It's found within, not meaning, and esoteric, not meaning that esoteric should not be seen as meaning that it's like obscure or hidden or anything like that. It simply should mean that it's something that involves searching within the interior.
Well, that's what I meant by poetic metaphysics, right?
Right.
And kind of an intuition. It's more, it's not rational, but it's not rational, right?
Right.
You
well,
have
this
to
is
have
great.
rationality to get you there, but there has to be a place where, and finding the grace notes, right? You have to. It's like playing jazz.
This is the exact perfect thing to say, Michael, because this is what he says is the key to justice, and he talks about in the context of the Anglo-Saxon and the Roman common law that make a provision for not just raw intellect alone, but intuition, which always plays the part of the defense, right? That always points toward mercy. So, and that it can't be done without it. Like when you separate the intellect from intuition, then you're just going to have severity.
Yeah. Or legalism, right?
Or legalism. Yeah.
Or as in Hamlet, right? The great line, God's bodkins, man, treat every man according to his deserts, and who shall escape whipping?
Right. There's I want to find that part about intuition, because since you were just talking about
I have it right here.
Oh, you do? Okay. Please read it for us, Sherry.
Page number, please.
It's 176, second chapter. Therefore, one has to know the extent of one's knowledge and ignorance when one makes a judgment. And one is always ignorant of the noumenal being or the soul of another. This is why no human judgment has bearing on the soul. And intuition, is it there for nothing? Certainly it exists and is there for something. Nevertheless, intuition, being perception due to sympathy and love, never accuses. It always plays the role of the defense, the advocate. As it perceives the soul of beings, it sees only the image of God in them. Seeing and knowing that the soul of the offender is always the first victim of all sin or crime that he could commit, intuition can play no other role than that of the advocate. The saying to know all is to forgive all refers to understanding, quote, from within, unquote. That is to say, intuitive and not to external understanding, i.e. phenomenal and discursive understanding. A moving formula for the role of intuition in the exercise of justice is given to us in the prayer of the Master as he was being crucified. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. This formula indicates three facts. 1, what they are doing from a phenomenal point of view is criminal. 2, judgment is handed over to the Father. 3, this is accompanied by the plea, forgive them, based on the certainty due to intuitive perception that they know not what they do. It is thanks to recognition of the role of intuition and intelligence, as distinct from the role of research in the establishment of facts due to understanding, that the strict justice of the latter faculty has been supplemented by equity in the exercise of justice in countries which have accepted principles of Roman and Anglo-Saxon law. I guess I could leave it there. He goes on to talk about Pilate, which is kind of interesting too.
Yeah, and the institution of the jury, which he says is a phenomenon of Christian culture.
Just a bit further down, he says, now justice is done only in the case when all the pertinent facts for and against the accused are established, then weighed by understanding, and then submitted to the judgment of intelligence. The three functions of justice, instruction, debate, and decision, correspond to the 3 degrees of knowledge, hypothetical, argumentative, and intuitive, designated by Plato as doxa, or hypothetical opinion, dianoia, or conclusion based on arguments, and episteme, or intuitive perception. In fact, the facts established and presented by the instruction serve as the basis both for the prosecution and for the defense for their respective hypotheses, guilty and innocent. One can say, therefore, that the process of the exercise of human justice consists in the total exertion of all 3 cognitive faculties of the human being: the faculty of forming hypotheses on the basis of data supplied by the senses, doxa; the faculty of logical discursion or intellectual weighing for and against these hypotheses, dianoia; and lastly, the faculty of intuition, episteme.
And notice how this is all heading in one direction, which pardon me, is almost universal in sophiology, and of different sophiologists through history. Is he concludes with apokatastasis, right?
Yeah.
Call David Bentley Hart right now.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, because
Right.
that's where it goes, and that's
Yeah,
where
that's
David
where it
goes.
goes.
That's why I think David is ultimately a sociologist,
Right.
Yeah.
because that's where his intuition goes. The same thing, I think, Milbank.
Well, I think my natural intuition that had to be the story that I've had like for as long as I can remember, because it's the only thing that makes sense, right? Like that's what I think attracted me to sociology, is because it's already the vision of reality that was the only vision of reality that made sense to me at all. I like what Tomberg says here, because Tomberg here is very balanced though, because he criticizes those who want to like intellectually argue against the reality of hell, even though he's pointing toward apokatastasis, right? So he still wants to reserve like a reality for hell. It's just that it's not, he recast it in a different way.
It's an intensity and not a quantity.
Right.
And
I think
that comes forward in a lot of anthroposophic thought, actually. Like I remember it from the book by Emil Bock. Time was intensified. It wasn't, the end is near does not mean that the quantity of time is coming to an end, but that the intensity of time intensifies.
Right.
And becomes compressed. So there's this idea of intensity and compression, right? And that is like when he talks about suicide there, that is what the person who is suicidal feels. They feel hemmed in on all sides, that there is nothing, there's nowhere to go, right? The space is shrunk to nothingness, like it's suffocating, right? And so the only escape is to jump off a cliff, basically.
Yeah, and that's the problem with. I mean, I mentioned Hamlet, right? And the Hamlet, the scene, of Ophelia's funeral, right? You know that she can't have a full funeral because her death was suspicious. You know, she had a hand in her own death, or it's right, and which is the legalistic thread that runs through Christianity, right there, right?
Right.
That doesn't take into account, and this is why I think Tomberg brings in karma and reincarnation here, because there are so many things you can't take into account in a person's struggles or whatever
Well, you
happens to
can't
be.
know, like he essentially says, you can't know their essence. This is why he says you can't condemn, right? Because you cannot know a person's essence. And if you think about the microcosm, macrocosm, the relationship, the mediating role, like I wanted to read actually this thing here of man, then that has to be true. You can't know the essence of God, so you cannot know the essence of the person. And I think that, that the idea of the Whitestone name kind of hammers that home. We don't even know our own essence, right? We can't know this. And I just wanted to read on page 187, there's a quote here from, I think it's from Hermes Trismegistus, or how do you say that? Hermes' defense of man's cognitive faculty.
Ah, yes.
For man is a being of divine nature. He is comparable not to the other living creatures upon earth, but to the gods in heaven. Nay, if we are to speak the truth without fear, he who is indeed a man is even above the gods in heaven, or at any rate, he equals them in power. None of the gods of heaven will ever quit heaven and pass its boundary and come to earth, but man ascends even to heaven and measures it. And what is more than all beside, he mounts to heaven without quitting the earth, which is like this Harding-esque, mediatory role here, right? So so vast a distance can he put forth his power. We must not shrink then from saying that a man on earth is a mortal God and that a God in heaven is an immortal man.
Get up, stand up. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, and that just so reminded me of Harding's book, Nate. When he talks about the universe being contained within him, that he reaches up into it, right? That he's headless. That the whole thing of the man is that he is infinity, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then this gets to the quote by, I never remember the guy's name, but he wrote the foreword in Signature of All Things from Jakob Böhme. I should just read it because I don't remember it offhand. Where he talks about man being the masterpiece of God. Let me see here.
William Law?
No. John something or other.
John Sparrow?
No, that's not it. It says, it's the preface to the reader in The Signature of All Things. This book is a true mystical mirror of the highest wisdom. The best treasure that a man can attain to unto in this world is true knowledge, even the knowledge of himself. For man is the great mystery of God, the microcosm, or the complete abridgment of the whole universe. He is the Mirandum Dei Opus, God's masterpiece, a living emblem and a hieroglyphic of eternity and time, and therefore to know whence he is and what his temporal and eternal being and well-being are, must needs be that one necessary thing to which all our chief study should aim.
Which is what all esotericism is about.
Well, see, to me, that's the Hermeticist. That's what I would have done when, I couldn't have propositionally laid it out, but I could have described it like that. That is what the Hermeticist is. He stretches, he's bound to the earth and he stretches to the heavens, right? And I mean, I'm going to just throw a bunch of random ideas in here, but this is what the Theotokos does. The Theotokos tethers us to the earth, right? And we reach into the heavens as sons and daughters of God. But we're still, like it says in this quote here, we mount to heaven without quitting the earth because we're bound by the Theotokos.
You want to hear my Theotokos joke?
Sure.
Yes, you do. So one day in heaven, Jesus is walking around and he sees this guy, goes, he's supposed to be in hell. What's he doing here? And he's supposed to be in hell too. And he finds St. Peter. He says, Peter, what's going on? There's all these guys that are supposed to be in hell. Why are they here? He goes, it's your mother, sir. He keeps letting him in.
Right.
That's a good one.
You know, that so aligns with like with medieval Christianity. Like there was like Mary was seen as like less harsh and more approachable. Like that's one of the reasons Marian devotion was such a huge thing in the Middle Ages, is that, you know, Mary has the qualities of a mother, and so like was seen as being both more approachable and more merciful. So yeah,
and a child is tethered to their mother. Literally.
Right. Yeah. No, that's really good. So I want to backtrack just a little bit, because like something I mean, it's when you were talking when he was talking about like intuition as the advocate, it's I couldn't help but think of the fact that like this is what the Holy Spirit is called as well, the Paraclete, right?
Mhm.
Right,
So they're
the
playing the
advocate.
same role, right? The Paraclete
Absolutely.
is also, so there's a connection between this intuition that is within you and the Holy Spirit, and both of them are always the voice of love. So in as much as the Spirit is dwelling in us, it's going to point us toward the path of love, which is why love has the final say when it comes to justice, when he really gets down to brass tacks.
And that's why, like George MacDonald says, God's justice is mercy, right? They're the same thing. That's what makes them the same.
Right.
Love.
Yeah. And I was also the way he was talking about it, I know, like that's what the operation of the Holy Spirit is. Like sometimes we call the spirit of truth, but that can be misleading if you're thinking about it in this very abstract and intellectual way as the truth. Because what I think where you can really see the Holy Spirit in operation is when you have those brief moments when you are given the gift of seeing a person as God sees them.
Yeah, it's the spirit of the real, not
Yeah.
the spirit of truth. Anyway, right?
Right.
So, like St. Paul says, you know, not only we will be known, we will know even as we are known. But in another place, I can't remember where it is, St. Paul talks about God knows us through our love.
Yeah.
Right. That's how God gets. Oh, there he is. That's how we reveal ourselves.
Yeah,
I remember,
you can't actually know someone if they don't love you.
Yeah, years ago, in my 20s. Now in Detroit, there's a big Hare Krishna community, and I was friends with, actually used to run sound for my band. His name was Paul, but his religious name was Pandu, and he used to always tell me the Hare Krishna stories. But one of them stuck with me for years. That one of the ways in which one of the ways we show love is to reveal our minds to another. Because I mean, if you think about it, that's an act of absolute vulnerability and openness, but it's a form of love, which very much I mean, I've been living with it for 35, 40 years now. And I think in a way that is coincides, or is very sympathetic to the Hermetic understanding of things, right? Because if we're burdened by thinking understanding and truth are due to some set of rational propositions, which, I mean, there's certainly rationality involved, but that's not what gets you to truth. I mean, this is Bonaventure, right? Bonaventure 101. That's not what gets you to truth. It helps you learn how to walk, but eventually you have to let go of the crutches, right?
And it's good for exposing falsity. It is good for that, but it doesn't, just because it exposes
Delusion.
falsity doesn't mean that it can lead you directly to truth.
Right.
That's great.
Well, I had another thought when you were talking about that, Nate.
Go for it.
Because what I was just said previously about the tethering, not quitting the earth, but yet being in the heavens, right?
Right.
On page 179, he says, human effort is therefore not for nothing in the domain. No, wait. The practical meaning of the heaven-earth balance is that of cooperation with grace.
Yes, that was.
Human effort is therefore not for nothing in the domain of the working of grace. Neither election alone from above, Calvinism, nor faith alone below, Lutheranism, suffice for the requirements of the heaven-earth balance. Chosen or not chosen, having faith or not, it is necessary for us, for example, to forgive those who trespass against us, here below, in order for our trespasses to be forgiven above. There is a correlation not in measure, but rather in nature, between the scale below, effort, and the scale above, gift, of the heaven-earth balance.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's the kind of, Christianity is a great thing for deconstructing Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? I mean,
Right.
there's, because you look, I don't care where you look, there are all these severe elements in any form of Christianity,
Mm-hmm.
And very juridical, and yet the gospel itself deconstructs that. The Lord's Prayer deconstructs that.
Yeah,
and I think, and I seriously, I think about this a lot. I think institutional Christianity has destroyed Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And so what do you do with that information, though? Right. In fact, on my podcast, Mike and I talked to David Cayley, and this is one of the things we were talking about with what's the future of Christianity is, what do you do?
Right.
I mean, institutions get a beautiful tradition and everything, but a lot of the things we see that are wrong in the world can be laid on the church's footsteps. And I don't know what Tomberg would say about this, but I would say not least among them is the problems we're having with gender right now.
Right.
I think that goes right back to the Christian tradition.
How so? I'd like to hear you elaborate that a little bit more.
Well, Sophia who, right? Okay,
gotcha.
For one, but also even early in the church, I write about this in a couple of books, is that there was even a question of whether women had souls. And what happens when the monastic orders call all the shots? Then, even though marriage is considered a sacrament, it gets demoted,
right,
to not as much as a sacrament as holy orders. But it's okay if you can't cut the holy orders, right? Which is there have been untold problems that have arisen from that. I mean, that's just one thing. Right? But and I think that's what's important about sophiology is it can I don't know if anybody wants it to, but it can bring this healing or restoration of Christianity to its true essence. I think, of course, people are going to say, "Yeah, that's what you think," but that's what I like you said, Nate. I mean, intuitively, I couldn't be anything else.
Right. Yeah. Right.
It can't be anything else.
Right. There's no other option.
And then we go back to the problem that he lays out in the beginning, the problem of the one and the many, right? Is this, what do? You got this tradition, you feel you obligated to work within, yet you also feel that tradition that you feel obligated to work within has created all kinds of problems that you're also dealing with.
Let me ask you, Michael, I want to get your take on this. There's some controversy right now in the Episcopal Church because they're moving toward
Open table.
an,
Yeah.
an open table.
Yeah.
And I'm torn about this because part of me still like respects tradition, and like Tomberg is very clear in this about all the many reasons why we need to respect the exoteric tradition and
Right.
et cetera. And so Tomberg would think that too. But at the same time, I just recently read David Bentley Hart's book Tradition and Apocalypse, and I think he correctly points toward the proper way to look at tradition is in terms of the final cause. And I think that you and I both have and Sherry, I think too, has the sense that the church, the intended scope of the community of the church is the entire cosmos becoming a unity of heaven and earth.
Mm-hmm.
So on the one hand, the tradition like that we have, clearly it would be against the tradition that we have clearly handed down, the exoteric tradition. But at the same time, in terms of, if I look at it in terms of the telos,
Right.
it seems right. So I'm actually kind of torn on it. I was wondering what you had to say about that.
Well, I think if we were to look back to when Christendom was an actual thing, that wasn't even a question, right? But I think what we see now with this, whether it's a question of open table or whether, it disgusts me that that Orthodox will not admit Catholics to communion, but Catholics will admit the Orthodox to communion. What for? Right?
Yeah.
So I hate that kind of legalism, but I think that's what you're going to get when you have a corporate structure. And I mean corporate in the business sense, right?
Right.
And that's the problem I think the Episcopal Church is faced with. They have a corporate structure. What's our policy on this, right?
Right.
And this is why I'm getting more and more anti-establishment, more and more pro-house church, because if you had a house church, that wouldn't even be an issue, right? You can bring people in and they're sincere. And here's an example. So when I was at Marygrove College, which is a Catholic liberal arts college in Detroit before it closed abruptly in 2017, we would have masses occasionally, right? And most of the students were probably not Catholic, but they were probably Christian. And here's what would happen. So they'd have communion, and the IHM nuns who ran the joint were pretty much open table practicers, even though they weren't supposed to be. But what would happen is after these masses, and this is the college students, they would find hosts in the pews or stuck between the leaves of the hymnal or something. So that's, so I think just in a practical way, people don't know what's going on. And so they treat it in a cavalier way, right? So that's the problem, I think, with open table, is you have that. I mean, because what's the point, right? If we're not together, at least in recognizing that there's a sacred thing is going on here, So I think now I don't know if there's a way to solve this, even other than to say small is beautiful. But I think I think those corporate structures need a policy, which is what they're arguing about right now in the Episcopal Church, right? But I can notice Jesus doesn't work by policy in the New Testament.
But isn't this why there is initiation into the mysteries through baptism?
See, but I'm not sure that I think that initiation is a proper concept for Christianity, because I think that's actually what Jesus came to obliterate, is the idea that you need to be an initiate.
And I have to say that I think that idea of initiation into the mysteries was not Christian. That was borrowed from the pagan mysteries.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's part of what with Constantine's reforms. He's like, well, you better make it look like more the religion we practice. Okay, so they changed it, which is why in the Orthodox Church, the remnant of that is they administer all the rites of initiation at one time to infants. But in the juridical Roman and Western Church, they do it in installments, right? So it's like, okay, apprentice, fellow craft, master, right? That's, and I think it's antithetical to what Christ is doing.
Yeah, but how else would you eliminate the cavalier way people treat the host, for example?
Well, I think that's an endemic problem of corporate structure of Christianity right now. It wasn't in the past because everybody got it, right? When there were, even in Anglican, post Reformation England, everybody still knew what it was there, right? It was a cultural assumption,
Right.
But I think it's strange. I mean, I don't know how to solve it, like I said, but I think analyzing why there's a problem, that's why there's a problem, is because we don't live in a Christian culture, and we should not pretend that we do. And I think Open Table pretends
that's like,
we do.
Right. Well, I think actually
You assume people will do it with the right intention.
Oh, I see what you're saying. I kind of assumed that part of the thinking behind it was that was an acknowledgement of the fact that we don't live in a Christian culture now, in order to make it to make the church seem more inviting.
Well, and also, let's fill those collection plates, people.
Oh yeah, right? That's true too.
Like, I don't know why.
I don't think that'll work though. But I can see it, but I mean, I can still see I can see a good theological impulse between wanting to do something like that. Like, you can make a case there, but your point is taken about what the motives might be, and what's really going on with it. I think those are legitimate, which is and I sense that too. I couldn't really articulate what it was, but I feel uneasy about it too, even though I can kind of see a theological point.
Right. But I think this is what I was saying. I think the small is beautiful approach short circuits that,
always.
Yeah.
In everything.
I know.
In everything.
So, and I don't know how to do that. And, because my experience of Christianity in general, at least church going, not Christianity, is it can so easily be so impersonal. Right? It's, you don't feel like you belong. You don't feel, I mean, you try to get along, you go along, you try to do the things, but there's something that you don't feel like you belong. And
I've had that experience a lot. I'm very fortunate right now. I'm very blessed to be in a very small little Anglican church that I very much don't feel that.
And that's helpful. And that's what attracted us to the Byzantine Catholic Church, because they're typically smaller and I knew everybody's name, right?
Right.
Which certainly alleviates that problem. You run into a huge mega parish, or like these big Catholic parishes around here that have 4 masses on Sunday. It's like, wow, this is a lot of people.
Right.
I don't know. I just feel like whatever, I'm lost in the crowd here. It's like being at a baseball game.
Well, I mean, Tomberg talks about this exactly, like in that section on page 189.
Go for it. Share it with us.
Well, I'll just, therefore make use of the balance of justice and judge impartially. When you have done so, you will no doubt say, never will I throw stones in thought or through word or deed against the church, since it is she who makes possible and stimulates and protects human endeavor for the glory of God. And as Hermeticism is such an endeavor, it could not exist without the church. We Hermeticists have only one choice, either to live as parasites, for it is thanks to the church that we are able to live. If we are strangers to or hostile to the church, or to live as her faithful friends and servants, if we understand what we owe to her and so begin to love her.
Right.
Now is the time for, Michael read this already, but now is the time for the Hermetic movement to make true Christian peace with the church and to cease to be her semi-illegitimate child, leading a half-tolerated life more or less in the shadow of the church, and to become eventually an adopted child, if not a recognized legitimate child. But it takes two to love, and there is many a pretension to be abandoned in order to accomplish this. What is sure, however, is that if the two parties in question have at heart only the glory of God, all obstacles to this peace will evaporate in smoke. May the pretension of certain Hermeticists evaporate in smoke, namely to have the authority to found small churches under their own leadership and to set up altar against altar and hierarchy against hierarchy. On the other hand, may the pretension of certain theologians evaporate in smoke, namely to be a supreme tribunal without recourse to further appeal concerning all planes of existence beyond the five senses. The lesson learned through Copernicus and Galileo by theologians who arrogated to themselves the authority of a supreme tribunal for the perceptible world can also be repeated on higher levels of the world. In case of a relapse into the arrogant spirit of Galileo's judges concerning other planes of existence. The revealed and therefore absolute truths of salvation, yes, these are entrusted to the magisterium of the church, and therefore to the work of the interpretation, explanation, and presentation of competent theologians. But the immense domain where salvation operates, the physical, vital, psychic, and spiritual worlds, their structure, forces, beings, their reciprocal relationships, their transformations, and the history of these transformations, aren't all these aspects of the macrocosm and the microcosm, and many others, the field of work to be accomplished for the glory of God and for the benefit of one's neighbor, for all those who want to do so and who do not want to bury in the earth the talents given to them by the master, and thus to be unprofitable servants.
So here this begs the question for me, just this is one of the afflictions of being a philosophy professor.
Mm-hmm.
What does Tomberg mean by the church? And what do each one of us mean by that term? And what do our respective representatives, hierarchical representatives, what do they mean by it?
Well, he was Catholic, right? Does he mean the Catholic Church here?
He seems to mean the Catholic Church, because like there's a part where he says, basically, God forbid we live in a world where certain phrases of the Latin Mass aren't said, and he actually gives the phrases in Latin.
Yeah.
So I think for Tomberg, it's the Catholic Church, and he's very harsh on Protestantism throughout the text. So I think for him, I think he kind of arrived at kind of a similar place to where Guénon arrived, which is that there's really, like, the Catholic Church is the only place where there's any living tradition in the West. But Tomberg was also of an age where I don't think Tomberg had any exposure of note to Orthodoxy, though. Oh,
yes, he did.
Oh, did he? Okay.
Well, he was Estonian. He almost entered the Orthodox.
Oh,
Church.
Really? So he chose Catholicism over Orthodoxy.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, yeah, and he does say why too. It's because he actually
Berdyaev and so on too. Right.
Well, he talks about how the Orthodox have an incomplete hierarchy because of the lack of the office of the Pope.
Right. But he also, you can tell in his later book, Lazarus Come Forth, he starts rethinking that after he saw what happened from Vatican II. He's like, wait a minute. Wait a minute. Yeah.
Oh, cool. Well, that's one of the reasons I didn't become Catholic, because of the incomplete hierarchy of the Orthodox Church.
Right.
I needed that left open. I want the dome to really truly be the dome. Mm-hmm. Right. So
and so as we can see, we just let ourselves into a major problem.
Right. I
don't know what we don't. I don't know if we agree or disagree, but we can recognize that there is not a universal agreement, even within each confession that I'm thinking just the sacramental confessions of Anglican, Orthodox, and Catholic, of what the church is.
Well, I think we've come to the point. I think we've come to the point where, and I said this in my conversation with Sam, our friend Sam, on his podcast Transfigured. We had a discussion about David Bentley Hart's book Tradition and Apocalypse, and I said in that, and apparently David didn't like what I said, because I said that he had certain Protestant sensibilities. He didn't like that I said that he had Protestant sensibilities, but this is what I meant.
Well, he's got two brothers who are Protestant priests.
The one point that the Reformation has proved true on, and you can look at this by seeing where Orthodox and Catholic thought has moved since the Reformation. The Protestants won the argument that the invisible church is primarily what is referred to when we're talking about the church. Like they
The
definitely,
bride.
they've
The
been
bride.
proven correct about that. So I would say that ultimately we can definitely define the church as those people who are sincerely attempting to follow Jesus, even if they don't know his name. But those people who are sincerely following Jesus, those are the people that comprise the church.
Well, I don't have any problem with that. I mean, I never went to church. I haven't been to church since 1996, you know, and then I just last weekend got baptized into the Orthodox Church.
First
And-
time back since 96.
But I would say that Tom Burke's caution against like trying to form your own institutional hierarchical churches, where he talks about pitting altar against altar, I think that is still wise, because I think
Well,
you
we've
really-
seen where that goes, right? In Protestantism.
you know, I think it's
Yeah.
appropriate for members of the true and invisible church to find themselves in different physical churches, practicing different practices, and they'll recognize and find each other through the Holy Spirit without there having to be an institutional unity.
Which is, and it's I think we're at a unique moment in Christian history right now, because all of those kind of structures are, if they haven't fallen apart, they're kind of dead men walking right now.
Right.
Yeah,
right?
but they're being enlivened again, don't you think? Like, no?
I don't think so. No, I don't
Oh.
think so. I mean, I hate to say that, because I've always wanted it to be true, but if I'm intellectually honest, I don't think it's true at all. I don't think it's true at all. I mean, you know, the Orthodox and Catholics, for instance, have been in talks to reunite for 1,000 years, or maybe not, you know, or it's at least since the 1400s. Do you really think they want union?
Yeah.
Do you think that's
But
what?
I'm just
Or do you
thinking-
think?
I think the
They
Catholic
don't.
Church. I think the Catholic Church desperately does, though.
I don't know.
Like there's a reason for that. There's a reason for that meme, you know.
Well, I just think
they might
you know,
feign that they, I get it. I have an intuition that they feign that they do, but it's definitely on their terms.
Well, a friend of mine who's
You
an
know.
Orthodox priest always says, "Yeah, if the Catholics ever want to join the Orthodox, I'm fine with that." And he's really funny. He's one of my favorite people on earth. But
Yeah.
I just don't think it's. I just don't see it. I don't see any evidence. And what I think is that if the people lead, the bishops will follow.
But what if okay, so this is the Valley of the Dry Bones, though, right? Like you've got these skeletons and they're enfleshed, but it's slow. It's you know, it's all the parts, right? It's the sinew and the tendons and the circulation and the, you know, until finally they're fully fleshed, right?
Right.
And I don't know.
But do we pretend they're alive when they're not?
Right, but do we have but do we have an obligation to rescue the father, you know, from the underworld in that case?
Well, I think
That's,
you know, I think I know this is controversial, but I say, you know, when they found Christ in the temple, did you not know I'd be about my Father's business, right? So you just do it, right? You don't wait for the
right.
You don't
I
wait
agree.
for the right encyclical or
right.
Hey,
No.
you know, like I guess for me, because I didn't even grow up. I was 14 when my parents became Christians. I went to church for a couple of years, then I left home. And then when I got married, my husband and I went to church for 9 out of 11 years in Switzerland. And it was, you know, every morning, every Sunday morning, people would ask me my name again. that's how friendly it was. Oh, what's your name again? And then I just said, you know what, I'm done. I don't even know what this is. Like, what is this supposed to look? What is this be? What is this? Right? Why am I doing this? And actually that happened after joining a small house church, which just went really off the rails. And I said, okay, that's it. I'm done. I'm not doing church anymore. And And so I don't have a history of a church hierarchy in my head. It doesn't live there, you know? And being in the Orthodox Church, it was the only thing that I could find that resembled what I was already doing, where I had my feet on the earth, right? But overhead was the dome. And I had a cosmic, I don't know, sense, a familiar cosmic sense within the Orthodox Church. And I needed accountability in my life. That was something I needed. So that's why I did it.
Sure.
Yeah.
There's a lot of great things about the Orthodox Church.
Mhm.
I mean,
And that's
for
what attracted
sure.
me to the Byzantine Church 20,
Yeah.
30, almost 30 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
But I'm, but I'm well aware that any kind of institution is going to fail. It's going to fail badly because it's human,
right.
And that was my big problem for all those years, was I just didn't want to attach myself to anything like that. But then I realized, well, I'm also an institution and I'm failing badly here too.
It's
Might as well fail badly with a bunch of other people.
It's implicit within that the gates of hell shall not prevail, that they will assault. So, I mean, we shouldn't expect there to be not any problems, So
That's right. You remind me, Sherry, of something Mae West said when she said, what they asked, she wasn't married. She said, marriage is an institution, and I'm not ready to be put into an institution.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm not an individualist, but I think that we have an effect on the world in ways that we have no idea. Like one person, right? And if one person cultivates, if one person decides to do what Tomberg is suggesting here and mediate, right, between heaven and earth.
Yeah.
And you have no idea what that ripple effect is going to do in the world. And I personally think that's the only way to change anything. That's it.
Well, yeah, but it's the path of ultimately, if we're bringing it back to what his primary theme in the chapter here, which is justice, which is the equilibrium, which is the equilibrium, right? Which is ultimately love, right? Which mediates between the extremes of wisdom and the extremes of power.
Mm-hmm.
That's where we need to be. And I think that's the question we need to be asking ourselves when we're talking about the church too.
Well, how different do you think the church and your immediate, like your extended family are? I think almost everyone has, members of their family that they wouldn't choose to be friends with if they weren't their family. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
But you have to get through it. You have to do, and I've always perceived the family as the arena in which you practice loving your enemies. In a real way.
Sherry, the social realist.
Because you can't get away from them.
Right.
That's right.
Right? They're not the neighbor you can ignore, right?
Yeah.
They're your family. And sometimes they're your husband or your wife. There's days, right, when that person is your enemy. And how do you love them, right? And this is the way I see it. That's how I see it.
It's interesting. One of the things he says when he's talking about wisdom, which he uses the phrase Greeks in quotation marks to represent those parts of, and he says they're within the church, right? They're not just within the church, but they're within the culture too. They're basically, what he's talking about is kind of two different temperaments, right? So those who seek intellectually seek wisdom, And then the Jews as those who like seek
Look,
the
signs.
displays of power, signs, miracles. Yeah. And he says that those two extremes are the things that lead to all heresy.
Yeah, that was interesting.
And which is why, in my opinion, the doctrine of universal salvation and the restoration of all things cannot be heresy when it's rooted in love. But when it's rooted in love, I think Tomberg is correct to point out that it cannot dismiss with the notion of eternal hell. It just has to understand it in the way that Tomberg presents it, which is in a non-quantitative sense, where it becomes a reference
Well,
to
yeah, I mean,
quality.
Is there eternity in hell? Is there time, I should say? Is there time in the spiritual world?
Well, he's actually like, it's entering into eternity without an ounce of love is what is eternal hell. But he also says that, well, let me find that section.
Well, it's interesting because the way he describes eternal there is, it's like, we know that feeling, right? Like when I've suffered with depression, and it feels like it's never going to end.
Yeah.
Like it has an eternal
this quality. Is exactly, yeah, that's precisely what he's talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that
it's a qualitative experience.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. Which is why, and I've said this before, maybe we don't need to read the quote. I think, oh, here we go. Oh, that's a good part. Okay, here we go. It's quite a, let's see. The following is the answer we arrive at when we abandon a quantitative correlation between time and eternity. Whoever enters the region of eternity enters the region of eternity without an ounce of love, and whoever enters the region of eternity without an ounce of love enters it without an ounce of love, i.e., enters eternal hell. For to live without love, this is hell. Mm-hmm. So to live without love is hell.
It's an allusion to the brothers Karamazov, right?
Right. And to live without love in the region of eternity, this is to live in eternal hell. Hell is the state of the soul powerless to come out of itself, absolute self-centeredness, dark and evil isolation, i.e., final inability to love. Nicholas Berdyaev, The Destiny of Man. This subjective state of soul is neither long nor short. It is as intense as eternity is. Mm-hmm. Similarly, the blessedness a saint experiences in the vision of God is as intense as eternity, although it could not so last because someone present at the ecstasy of a saint would time it as a few minutes. The region of eternity is that of intensity, which surpasses the measures of quantity we employ in time and space. Eternity is not a duration of infinite length. It is an intensity of quality, which, if compared with time and thus translated into the language of quantity, is comparable to an infinite duration. Concerning this, Berdyaev says, in our life on earth, it is given to us to experience torments that appear to go on forever, that are not for a moment or an hour or a day, but just seem to last an infinity. Objectively, this infinity may last a moment, an hour, or a day, but it receives the name of everlasting hell. When Origen said that Christ will remain on the cross so long as a single creature remains in hell, he expressed an eternal truth. Nicholas Berdyaev, The Destiny of Man.
Right. But Origen was exhumed and declared a heretic.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, this is why I brought this up. This is why I brought this up, Michael.
Right. No.
Because when he's talking about heresy here, I think that he's getting at something deeper than the things. He does talk a lot about historical heresies here, but I think this is why I always say, like, and Augustine didn't follow his own advice, but when Augustine suggested a hermeneutic of love as the way to read scripture, this is correct, because love will never lead you to heresy.
Right.
It won't.
But that's the point I was trying to make initially, is that when we interrogate these assumptions about these terms we use, like the church or whatever happens to be, they can't not start to fall apart in some way. and which is good because that means the idol is crumbling.
Right.
And so you're
Yeah.
trying to see that which shining through, which, you know, you felt the attract. I mean, I know for a fact, after I read this book, it took a couple of years, but I was really drawn toward a more traditional Christianity, Catholicism. I couldn't find it in the Catholic churches around me, and the traddy churches were kind of weird. So that's why I wound up as a Byzantine Catholic. Because
the problem with the trad churches is they're caught up in the wrong period of Catholicism. They're all stuck in like the early modern period. They're not. If traditionalism was more medieval, it would be a much healthier,
that's right. Yeah,
healthier.
Which
movement.
is interesting. Well, this is true. I mean, because prior to the Reformation, it was a very different church, the Western Church.
Yeah.
In fact, that's what I love about the Anglican liturgy is it actually maintains some of those things from the Rite of Sorum, for instance.
Yep.
And there was an icon screen. They called it the rood screen. There was for the longest time. There's only a couple of churches in England that didn't get destroyed by the Reformation.
Right. Yeah.
But
some of those old English churches they look a lot like Orthodox churches, the really old ones.
I mean, they're beautiful. I mean, you just can't help but be moved by the beauty in these spaces and in the liturgies.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
You can't help.
No, I definitely like my first time in an Orthodox church was one of the most beautiful things I've ever experienced.
I've never been in one. Never been in one. And where I got baptized, it's a rec hall for a Catholic church.
Really?
With a temporary iconostasis and everything gets set up and taken down.
The service I attended was at this. It's in this little rural area, like kind of like in between Tacoma and Olympia, and there's an old Russian Orthodox church there, and they have their main church is in Tacoma, but they have this out in the sticks historic chapel that was built in the 19th century. That's just it's not that big, but it's just really beautiful old historic chapel, and they do the services in Church Slavonic once a month there. And that service I went to was in Slavonic, and it was actually a college field trip, believe it or not. We were studying the Tale of Igor's campaign in my Great Books program at Evergreen, and the professor who was teaching it was Orthodox and a member of that congregation. So since we were studying the Tale of Igor's campaign, she thought it might be good for us to get an experience of Russian culture. So we went to this Russian Orthodox church in the sticks of Western Washington, and it was just I'd never experienced anything like it. It was amazing.
Yeah, I mean, I get it. You know what I mean? I get the attraction. And Tom Berg certainly pushed me in that direction at that time. But it's a question I live with, right? What is the church?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What is the church? I mean, I live with this constant. It's a constant. I wouldn't call it struggle, but it's a constant presence in my life. What is it? What do I mean by it?
And the church
and division hurts me.
Yes.
And like I mentioned earlier with the division of communion.
And you
know
what?
Don't get it.
It's those poles that he talks about, like the wisdom and power pole. That's what keeps the church divided. That's the equilibrium of love. That's where unity comes. So it's as much as we're focused on those poles, it keeps us divided.
Yeah. No.
And the other thing is that, like, to me, like the church itself has refused so much of what the church is actually conceived to be. Because the church is supposed to be a full-throated actual community. It's supposed to be an alternative to the polis. And it hasn't been that for a very, very long time.
It's been the polis.
Yeah. Yeah.
And now it's the rival polis, right?
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, we can't, and there won't, until the church, whatever we think the church is, but until there's a movement of the church to fulfill that, the kingdom won't come.
No.
And that's why it isn't happening.
And that's
Right.
actually the original subtitle of the Submerged Reality had something like ecology, ecumenism, et cetera, et cetera. I can't remember how I pitched it, but that was the original subtitle because I thought that Sophiology, Sophia, offers the way out of that, political confessionalism.
Right.
And that, but though it's sacramental, that's why, my thought has always been that the more sacramental or more sacramentally configured denominations of Christianity would be the ones to most naturally come to this. Even though I did get a call not too long ago from a evangelical Baptist minister who all of a sudden got turned on about Sophiology.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and it's happened more times than you might think. But
yeah. Hey,
But there
the
is a
Spirit blows
liturgical
where it will.
movement. There is a liturgical movement in evangelicalism too,
Yeah,
right now.
right. Oh, you know what? I discovered the weirdest thing. I think I shared it on Voxer at one point. There's a group of African American Pentecostal churches that were
Orthodox.
that
African.
now worship in an Orthodox fashion.
And they have
And I think the reason
an
that
icon
happened,
of John Coltrane.
yes, but I think the reason that happened is because the Orthodox churches can be so nationalistic and cliquish that they're not exactly that welcoming. So it's like,
No.
Here you have this group of churches that like were Pentecostal churches and all these leaders within these Pentecostal churches were attracted to Orthodoxy. Well, there's a reason why they didn't just become Orthodox. And they just started basically doing their own thing.
Yep.
And that's because the Orthodox Church does have a tendency to be really standoffish.
And the Byzantine Catholic Church too. The first church, my wife was baptized, and most of my kids were baptized in the Romanian Byzantine Catholic Church. But like Sherry had in Switzerland, repeatedly people would come up. Who are your people? I said, what do you mean, my people? What village are you from in Romania? I said, I'm Irish. What? Wait, you're Irish. What the hell are you doing here? I've had that so many times. And they didn't some people, I have to say, did not like us being there.
Right. Yeah.
And so we had to leave eventually because we got a lot of hostility and we couldn't figure out, why are we here? What am I doing here?
Yeah.
Eventually we ended up in a Ruthenian church which was not nationalistic at all. Thank God. But yeah, that's a real problem in Eastern Rite churches, whether Orthodox or Catholic, is there tends to be, and my brother-in-law, actually, he eventually left the Orthodox church. He was on his way to the priesthood. He eventually had to leave, and he was doing fundraising and doing mission work, but he had to leave too because, as they said, he is not one of our people.
Yeah.
It's like, what am I doing? What?
But and at the same time,
in this little mission that I go to, there's maybe 40 people tops at a divine liturgy. But normally they say because they only have divine liturgy once a month because the priest visits from Vancouver, and the rest of the time it's reader services, and there's maybe 15 people there. But there's a Greek lady, there's a Lebanese guy, Nur. There's a Bulgarian family, and there's a Ukrainian man, and so they pray the Lord's Prayer. Each one of those people prays it in their language as well.
That's
in the service.
Oh, that's cool.
And but it's an OCA church, and I think the OCA church is actually making
they're trying to be a little bit better about that. Yeah, they're making a difference because I've not felt unwelcome, but I don't think I would feel comfortable in an ethnic church. But those ethnic churches are cultural churches. Like they started out with immigrants who in exile,
moved into, stayed as a community, brought a priest from the motherland or wherever, right? And like this was their church. People are just like that. It's, when we lived in Telegraph Creek, some people would cut trail up into the mountains, and then they would call it their trail. You're not allowed to ride on that trail. Meanwhile, it's all Crown land. It's total wilderness. But they cut it out, so it's theirs. And that's kind of what these ethnic communities did. They established the church for their, culture, and it's theirs.
Yeah.
Right.
And that was sustainable through the early part of the 20th century when there was mass immigration from Eastern Europe and other places. But in the meantime, those churches, most of the ones I know, are kind of dwindling.
Yeah. And the OCA churches are interesting because there are a lot of Orthodox priests who became Orthodox out of the Protestant denomination in the OCA, and they have a Protestant bent to them, right?
So the converts too, right?
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's going to change the Orthodox Church, at least the Orthodox Church of America.
The Orthodox Church in America will have to, of necessity, take on certain Protestant sensibilities. It's inevitable because that's what America is.
But I think this goes back for me to the question of corporatism, right? What's our policy? And that is ultimately destructive to the gospel anyway.
I believe that too. I agree with you. And I know it's going to be a struggle for me being in this church, because I've been wandering around. Like I tell people I am in church. Like if you were to ask me what is church, I would say the cosmos. That's what I would say.
Right. Well, that is the final form of the church.
Yeah.
We're just ahead of people. It's all right.
That's why I'm somewhat sympathetic to the open table move of the Episcopalians. It's like I get it. Like, yes, like I also think that the eventual form of the church is simply the cosmos itself. So I get the impulse toward open table, but I think there are unintended consequences which we already talked about of that as well. So
I mean, when I was in the church that my parents moved into, the Plymouth Brethren, I had to wear a head covering. I wasn't allowed to speak. When they had Lord's table, all the men sat around the Lord's table and the women sat behind them, kind of thing.
Right.
And I knew it was all wrong. I knew it was wrong, but I decided to stay as long as God gave me permission to be there. And when I wanted something to happen at church, I just asked God to make it happen. So if we were at the Lord's table and I would want a hymn, I couldn't ask for it because I wasn't allowed to speak. And I'd say, could we sing hymn 137, Lord? And some man would stand up and say, let's sing hymn 137. And I would just be like, yes. This is perfect.
What hymn number was hymn 137? Or
I don't know. And sometimes I'd be thinking of a scripture and I'd say, I wish I could just read that out loud. And then someone would stand up and read it out loud, And so that gave me a hope that even with all the dysfunction, right, that God is there. He is there, and he's working with it. He's working with it.
Yeah, right. And he's there wherever love is present, right? I mean, that's like
right. So, but at some point I left because, and this is the thing that I don't like, I would say, I don't agree with people who say, stay where you are. Okay. In whatever denomination, just stay where you're planted, this idea, because if our life is a journey, right? If we are being transformed and made new, we can't stay where we are, right? We will always be moving, I think. And so when I was in the Plymouth Brethren and I kept my mouth shut and my head covered and asked God for hymns and scripture verses, and then it got to a point where God said, okay, now it's time to go. It's time to go. Let's, like Abraham, he didn't say where, he just said, it's time to go. Enough. And, the whole time I spent here, I constantly said to God, do I need to go back to church now? And he would say, no, not yet. And I was constantly checking in because I felt guilty,
Mm-hmm.
right? That I need a body. I needed
Well trained. That's right.
Yeah, I felt guilty, and God would just say, "No, not yet." You know?
Sherry, I think you know the story of how I ended up in an Anglican church,
Yeah.
right? So, I mean, that was like, it's not something I planned.
No,
I was kind of like in the mode of like, I was feeling that I needed to get back into a church.
you did it out of love.
Yes, my son came to me while I was in this mode of I had gone to a Christian Reformed church actually when I was in Iowa working on the Yang campaign with my wife, and I thought that was okay. I didn't really know that much about their theology at that point, but and then I visited a Christian Reformed church in near my home, and it's like, yeah, no, and it's like I was thinking about like just going back to the Catholic Church, and then and thinking about like the rigmarole and the paperwork that I have to go through in order to get an annulment, in order to receive communion, and thinking that was a big pain. And then my son comes to me out of the blue and says, "Dad, I think I want to be Anglican." And I'm like, okay, that's where we'll go.
Yeah.
Because that's where he wanted to be. And so that's where I'm at.
I mean, part of the reason that I really sense that God wants me in the Orthodox Church is because I need some authority in my life. I need accountability and I need authority. Because I can get very lost in the infinite in a way. And
structure.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I think we all, like, particularly as modern North Americans, like authority is something that we have to come to terms with because we have a natural aversion.
Maybe, yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Yes, I do. Yes.
So, I mean,
yeah.
Okay.
But I totally sympathize with you, Michael. Like, yeah, a lot.
Well, I probably would not be at this point had the last 2 years not happened.
Right.
Oh.
That, yeah.
Yeah.
That
was a struggle for me too. I actually wrote a letter to my priest about that. Yeah. Yeah,
that's when I was like, okay, this can't be right.
Right. When you allow both, when you allow that kind of disruption of the Christian liturgical calendar.
Well, not
for
only
that long a period of time.
Yeah.
Well, not only that, but I
that's
read
a cosmic disaster. That's literally a cosmic level disaster.
And where was the church?
Right, silent and complicit.
Yeah, where was the church when people were dying alone?
Yeah, that's what did it for me.
When priests were being mandated to be vaccinated by the Pope, right?
I know.
Like what on earth was going on there? Like
I don't know where it was. A couple of places I know in Australia for sure, but there were other places as well where fully vaccinated parishioners may come to confession.
Yeah. Right.
I can't see Jesus doing that. Get away from me. Yeah.
I got an announcement.
Lepers, get them away from me. They're contagious.
I got an announcement from the priest in Victoria who was postponing house blessings because of the pandemic. And I was like,
they'll be
okay. So, I mean, right now is when people need their house blessed more than anything.
Right.
And you're not going to go in there because you're afraid of a disease.
And it's so contrary to the behavior of Christians throughout history in similar moments.
I couldn't handle it. Like it really.
And it wasn't easy for me to come to those conclusions.
Yeah.
Because and I wanted it to be easy. I wanted to just go along and get along, just go with the flow. But I couldn't do it any longer and be intellectually honest.
Well, that's actually right. I mean, because this corporatism is the machine, right? It's what it is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, and let's face it.
And I think that's why I made me rethink what the church is.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Well,
not that I have come to a conclusion.
Have either of you read Solovyov's Tale of the Antichrist?
many
No.
times.
Okay, well, but that's a perfect example because like Soloviev there, it's just a remnant, just a small remnant that follows this like this leader who has not given up on the core of whatever each of the he has a representative of both of the Protestant, the
Yep.
Orthodox, and the Catholic tradition. He has a figure that represents each, and it's just a small remnant that follows the leaders that stand up for what's right against the Antichrist.
Yeah.
Whereas the mass institutional body of all
Goes with
three
the
traditions
Antichrist.
goes with the Antichrist.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So
Geez.
Soloviev is pointing right there at what is the church.
Yeah, he was no dummy, that guy.
No.
Right, exactly.
You know what? Have you read this? Have you read this book, Michael?
I have that book, yes.
Yeah, I'm reading it right now, and it's amazing.
Mhm.
I read The Russian Idea and Christianity and War by Soloviev. I ordered those.
Well, and Christian, the Antichrist is at the end of that.
Yes, it's at the end. I haven't
Yeah.
read it yet, though. I haven't got to the end.
Yeah.
And I ended up picking up this one, and I can't put it down. But yeah,
That's the Judith Kornblatt one, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I was hoping it was more of his writing, but I'm not disappointed by it. Actually, it's very good.
Good.
Yeah. But he called himself a Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox, Jewish, like he just integrated everything.
Yeah, he did.
Right.
He
right.
was he was a hermeticist. He was a unifying force. Right.
That's what sophiology does to people.
It does. Yeah.
It does.
Yeah.
It really does.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's, I think, why you're so agitated, because there is no unity, right? It's and
Well,
that's yeah.
Well, if put it this way, if you're going to leave it up to those idiots, there's never going to be unity, which
That's
is
right.
that's why there never has been.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
They
why
talk
do
a
you think,
lot.
Why do you think we have a culture war, Sherry? I mean, it's like, yeah, it's not just like there's no unity in the church or outside of the church. There's no unity at all.
No.
And there's no unity at all because it's just
No.
everyone is standing
No,
for
but
their
I mean,
side.
some people just have a personality that can't abide it, you know.
Can't abide what?
That kind of disunity, because it's a form of injustice.
Right. Yes, absolutely.
That's what it is.
Right.
And what justice wants to do is provide that equilibrium, right? Which is that unity, is that integration of all those things. And yeah.
Tom Berg says it's also peace, right? So he says
and
it's
it
the
gives
same.
you peace, yes.
Right.
Mhm.
Right.
Yeah. And if I think about it too much, it'll agitate me too. I'm just like la la la
La la la la la.
If you just keep, I mean, I think the best thing is just to keep focused on love, and that will what will bring you peace.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's like, what was it in James Cortides, his recent talk with Father Ludovicos?
Oh, that was so good.
Yeah, it was great. And there was a point in that conversation where Father Ludovicos says that, like, so long as you can think anything negative about a person, you do not love as God loves.
Right.
So
talk about pressure. Wow.
Right. So
I'm holding myself up to a high standard here.
Right. Well, but that's the only way the kingdom comes, is
to love properly. That's what
we can learn to love properly as God loves.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I should probably get going. My mother is getting a little agitated as we speak.
No problem.
Okay.
You go take care of your
her.
mother, Michael. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was really great.
I think that's a good note to end on. So we'll go ahead and end the conversation for today.
God bless you both.
Yeah.
You too.
You too, Michael. Bye-bye.